And if I told you that the most inexplicable spin of Lewis Hamilton in years was not a simple pilot error, but the direct consequence of a secret technical modification, inherited from Charles Leclerc, and designed by Ferrari for a millimeter advantage? Today I reveal you what was hiding behind the hidden component of Spa 2025. The epicenter of this controversy was a new suspension component that Ferrari had developed with the intention of raising the performance of his car, the SF25, but that until that time only Charles Leclerc had tested on two specific occasions, in Montreal and in the Mugello test circuit. Hamilton, on the other hand, had had no contact with this piece until that precise moment at Spa. And the result was immediate, drastic, and disconcerting. During a seemingly normal return, the British suddenly lost the control of the car in the iconic chicane bus stop, suffering an unexpected spin that left him out in the SQ1. For a pilot with his level of experience and palmares, this image was a powerful visual blow that caught the attention even of those who do not follow the sport on a regular basis. The funny thing is that the accident did not seem to have a clear explanation. There was no obvious speed or traced errors. It was a mechanical, or more precisely, a disconnection between the car and the pilot. And then the rumors began. The specialized media, the technical forums, the analysis channels and social networks, and even the paddock insiders began to indicate a common denominator: the new rear suspension component. A few hours later, Reddit's threads, the filtered telemetry screenshots and onboards analysis became indirect evidence that what had happened was not a simple coincidence. There was talk of a new configuration in the pivot power of the upper arm of the suspension, a subtle modification apparently, but with a deep impact on the dynamics of the car under certain loading conditions. Hamilton himself would confirm it later before the F1 TV cameras, visibly frustrated. "I had never felt something like that. Charles, happened the same thing the first time." This brief statement not only shed light on the seriousness of the matter, but confirmed what many already suspected. Ferrari had introduced a technical modification even in a validation phase in Hamilton, with unstable behavior if it was not perfectly understood. It was a bet that in theory could translate into valuable tenths, but also in an absolute disaster if it was implemented without adequate time and context. What Ferrari introduced in Spa-Francorchamps was not a simple replacement piece or one more known iteration. It was an ambitious bet, a deep and risky redesign of a key system in the architecture of the car, the rear suspension. And not any type of modification, but one that intended to radically transform the way in which the SF25 interacts with the asphalt in a critical phase of its behavior. The acceleration in low traction, just when the car leaves slow curves and must maximize the aerodynamic load generated by the soil. The objective was clear and technically brilliant. Allow the car to roll lower, minimizing the so-called height ride without causing rebounds, an indispensable condition for the floor of the car to work efficiently and generate downforce. Under the technical supervision of Loic Serra, Ferrari developed a set that included new reduced anchor points, modified geometry in the braces, and more crucially, a review of the upper arm of the suspension, the wishbone. The technical jewel, however, was in a millimeter detail. The position of the pivot point of that upper arm was lowered a few millimeters. In the eyes of someone not familiar with F1 engineering, it may seem insignificant. But at this level, these changes completely alter the behavior of the rear axle under braking and acceleration. This new geometry allowed playing with the angles of the car and opening the door to configurations that, in theory, offered a wider range to find the ideal balance, especially on tracks of low adhesion or with closed curves. Internal data and renders leaked even by analysts such as Giorgio Piola estimated a potential benefit of up to 0.2 due to circuits where traction is critical. But that advantage came with a very high technical price, and extreme sensitivity when calibrating the system. If the parameters were not absolutely precise, car height, tire pressure, aerodynamic load level, the system became unstable, causing sudden blockages on the rear axle when braking with little load, just what happened with Hamilton. It was not a piece that could install and forget. It required a long, gradual adaptation process and above all, accumulation of previous data in simulators and track. And that is where Ferrari's paradox appears. This development, designed to make a qualitative leap in performance, was first introduced into conditions where there was no room for error. Spa is an extremely technical circuit with large elevation changes and braking in support, and the chosen weekend was sprint format, which means that the total time on track before classifying was just an hour. That is, Hamilton premiered one of the most critical pieces of the car without the opportunity to adapt, to validate feeling, or correct errors. He was launched to the track with an element that even his teammate, Leclerc, who had already had 2 previous sessions to understand its operation, had been able to fully dominate his debut. It was a high-risk play. The reaction within Ferrari soon arrived, but it was not immediate or unified. During the first hours after the Hamilton incident, an awkward silence reigned in the garage. The technical team, led by Loic Serra and Jacques Clear, urgently reviewed the telemetry data while the track engineers tried to understand why the adaptation of the new component had failed so loudly. In theory, everything was inside the margins: the heights, the compression of the docks, the fuel load. Fred Vasseur, head of the team, ended up admitting it in statements later. "We did not want to delay it to Budapest. We knew it was risky, but we felt that Spa was the right place. With so few laps, it is impossible to extract everything." This phrase was the equivalent of tacit recognition that they had made a timing mistake. The suspension was promising, even revolutionary in some aspects, but the context chosen to prove it in real conditions was a strategic disaster. A single free training in one of the most unpredictable circuits of the calendar, with changing climate and without margin for real adjustments, was not the right environment to experiment with a piece that completely modified the rear dynamic of the car. The immediate consequence was double. On the track, Hamilton was out in the first sprint classification round, something that had not happened for more than a decade in normal conditions. But beyond the sporting coup, the really expensive was the damage to internal confidence between pilot and engineering. Hamilton is known for its sensitivity to the car, for its need to establish an almost symbiotic connection with the car. What happened in SPA not only affected his possibilities that weekend, but also altered his adaptation curve with Ferrari. It was just his third Grand Prix dressed in red, and he already felt empty by technical decisions that did not go through his filter. The pilot himself, although measured in his public statements, showed his frustration. "There were things that I did not understand completely. And when you don't understand something, you can't take it to the limit." The paddock reacted in different directions. Some analysts and ex-pilots praised Ferrari's courage for trying something so bold, even if the context was misguided. Others criticized what they considered a technical management error, an unnecessary precipitation motivated by the pressure of closing the gap with McLaren. Between engineers and technical chiefs of other judges, the debate was deeper. Should teams try such radical components on weekends of sprint format, knowing that there is no real time for corrections? Where is the line between innovation and recklessness? The Hamilton case in Spa became an example of a book for this modern Formula One dilemma: the need for constant evolution against calendar limitations. The reduced sessions, the little margin for test on track, and the obsession for every millisecond pushed the equipment to increasingly extreme decisions. And in this case, the limb did not translate with an advantage, but in a mismatch that undressed both the weaknesses of the SF25 and the logistics and human challenges of implementing innovations that have not matured enough. In addition, the FIA took note. Although there were no sanctions or formal investigation, the Federation did begin to consider new regulations on what type of components can be introduced at weekend sprint, evaluating whether it is necessary to limit certain structural changes when there is only one free session. Because Hamilton made it clear that even in a sport as meticulous as F1, there are physical and logistics limits that, if ignored, end up affecting security, show, and the fair development of the competition. What happened with Hamilton and Ferrari in Spa 2025 was not simply a technical management error or a bad weekend luck. It was a declaration of intentions, a symptom of the pressure that falls on the large structures when they face increasingly compressed seasons, increasingly consistent rivals, and an increasingly demanding hobby. In this context, each decision has a resonance that goes far beyond the timetable. What was seen on the track was just the visible surface of a much deeper iceberg. The debate on to what extent a team is willing to risk in his career for victory, and how much margin has a pilot to adapt when innovation does not expect for anyone. The introduction of the suspension component was not a minor experiment. It was a play that reflected the mentality of a Ferrari that seeks to leave behind the tag of conservative team and transform into a modern structure, aggressive and capable of marking technical trends. But in that attempt to run faster than the calendar, they ended up exposing their most recent pilot to a context for which he was not prepared. The consequence was immediate and expensive, but also revealing. Because within the technical chaos, fundamental questions arose. Who makes the key decisions in Ferrari? To what extent can the machine be pressed without fracturing the pilot? How long is it needed for an innovation to stop being a risk and become an advantage? Leave me your opinion. Not only because this channel lives from technical analysis, but because the community we build together is also enriched in the exchange of ideas. So take a few seconds, leave your comment with your point of view, share this video if you think it throws a different perspective on such a comment, and if you are not yet signed, this is the time.